you. Good to be with you. It's always good to be in South Florida, and particularly to share today. A couple of things beforehand. Jesse asked me to share. Happy to do it. We are, we have several of you who, some in the room, who are now participating in a Wheaton College Graduate School cohort. And by the way, we're in favor of what Trinity's doing, and we're doing what's, as a matter of fact, I'm on faculty at Trinity, Gene's on faculty at Wheaton. So we're partners on this journey. But let me tell you about our MA in Ministry Leadership. Matter of fact, do me a favor, Eddie, would you pass those out right there? And we'll give you some information about that. Jesse's actually starting the program. Jesse, who's home with probable COVID, and so a couple of you in the room are in the program as well, and we'll be offering, our intent is to offer some classes in Miami, but we do it through cohorts. So we actually would put together a cohort that would go together through the program, and we'll have classes in Fort Lauderdale actually in January. We have, some of you know that we have a cohort that is actually meeting at Calvary Chapel, where I preached on Sunday this weekend, and we'll be meeting there. Some of you know that Doug Souter, the pastor at Calvary Chapel, Fort Lauderdale, is a student in our program as well. And so we're excited that God's been blessing us to see our program grow. We've been able to bless a lot of students. Our program has grown by about 300% in the last few years. So we want to invite you to come be a part of that. If you have questions, catch me at lunch. Happy to talk more about that with you. I'm going to talk today about a pandemic missiology, and I want to tell you that the level of change the church has experienced in the last year is really an unknown level of change about how long the impact will last. What's changed, what will return to normal, we don't know. What we know is there's a stunning amount of shift, and it's not just a pandemic, but let's remember in January, before the pandemic, President Trump was impeached, and then we had the pandemic hit, and then the economic collapse, and then George Floyd's killing, and then protests against racial injustice, and then some of those ended into violent riots, and then you had the backlash against the racial conversation, which then became evident and obvious in social media and in our own churches. And then we had people in our churches responding to how we responded to the pandemic. 25% of the people in your church think you're a compromised coward for asking anybody to wear masks in the first place. 25% think that it's stunning that you're even meeting. How could you think about doing this in the midst of a pandemic? And so the level of division, then we had an election that some people think is settled and some people still think is not. And people are mad at you if you pray for, I've had pastors call me and say, should I pray for President-elect Biden? And what should I say? Should I pray for Joe Biden, or should I pray for President-elect Joe Biden, or this? And all these things, these are not things that you had to think about in 2019. Don't you miss 2019? What a stunning time we find ourselves in. And missiology is a discipline that looks at the cultural realities and help people engage the cultural challenges, the cultural moment that we're in. And we have literally fast-forwarded cultural change in 2020, not just the drama and the trauma of 2020, but the fact that culture itself has fast-forwarded. There's a helpful article by Ross Douthat in the New York Times. He's a former evangelical, now practicing Catholic, but a person of faith. And he writes, his article is called Waking Up in 2030, and how the 2020 has fast forwarded so many social issues. And with the change in leadership in Washington, we can expect to see many of those social issues impacting the church in a way that it hasn't. Don't misunderstand, the Trump administration has significant impact on churches. But so will the Biden administration. It'll be a different kind of impact as well. But suddenly we have fast forwarded to 2030 culturally, and how do we address this in a pandemic? I was thinking in terms of, in my November, I had the privilege, I started in November, I'm the interim pastor of a new church. The last time I was in Miami, I was interim pastor of Moody Church in Chicago. So they got a pastor. I served there for about 4 years as the interim teaching pastor there, which technically 4 years, I don't even know if that counts as an interim, but I was longer than 3 of their actual pastors were the pastor of that church. But I'm now serving as the interim pastor of a church in New York City on the Isle of Manhattan. It's on West 57th Street, and it's actually called Calvary Baptist Church. This is actually a picture of it. I wanted to show it to you because I want to talk some about the impact that the virus has had in different ways in different places. But this is Calvary Baptist Church. It's on West 57th Street. It's just down the street from Carnegie Hall. It's on Billionaires Row. So you can see behind it the super tall, the largest condominium, the largest tallest residential building in the world, up and down that street. And yet that building is no longer accessible to this church. They can't meet there anymore. Matter of fact, we met once since the pandemic began in March. And we gathered together in Hunter College Auditorium. Some of you know where that is if you ever attended Redeemer Presbyterian. Redeemer had used that space. We had to rent a 2,000-seat auditorium to fit 150 people in it, following the New York City rules. 4 police officers were there the whole time. Every person had to sign in, had to give their number, their address, their contact, everything that's there. Everything's changed. A couple weeks ago, I preached out at Saddleback Church. And when I say preached out at Saddleback Church, I flew out there. I stood in a room with 4 people and a camera because they're not meeting and they're not planning to meet in 2020 at all. A few weeks ago, I preached at a church in rural Illinois. Very different experience. Not a mask to be found in sight. And they're talking about rural church planting and how can we move forward. Every place we go, the pandemic in 2020 has had significant and disruptive impact on what we do. I had gathered the heads of church planting for 62 denominations and networks in the Church Planting Leadership Fellowship. And everything's changed because all of the schools that were open, almost all of them now are no longer open to churches. Partly because they're maintaining a bubble and there's all levels of complexity and difficulty. Many people talked about online church with caution. Now, Stadia, for example, some of you know Jeff Reed, he lives in Miami. Jeff actually leads their online church planting strategy. And I want to talk some about both the current reality and the missiological opportunities that are here as we walk through this. So I want to start first by just seeing just how everything has changed. Now, mind you, I'm going to talk some about headwinds of mission and evangelism that we're facing today. Some of the headwinds that we're facing. Go ahead and go to the next slide, the headwinds slide. And I want to talk through some of those headwinds that we're addressing. Now, get on a plane. Donna and I are actually spending more and more time in South Florida. We're here for 3 weeks, and next year we plan to be here for a couple of months and actually eventually establish here 3 months or more each year. We love what God's doing in South Florida. We want to be part of what God's doing in South Florida. So I invite you to come to your church sometime, and happy to connect with you as well. But one of the things when you get in a plane, it's fascinating. When you fly to Miami, your flight can be 30 minutes early or 30 minutes late based upon the headwinds. When you go east to west, it's worse. You can actually be 45 minutes delayed because you get in the air and there are headwinds and it slows down the plane. Well, in 2020, there are significant headwinds already at work that have been accelerated by 2020, the division, the pandemic, the tumultuous and the turbulent times we're walking through. Let me talk about some of those headwinds. One of them is shrinking nominalism. Shrinking nominalism. Now, let me explain. Much of what we have done in evangelism is reaching out to people who think they're Christians to convince them they're not Christians, so we can tell them how to rightly become Christians and they can become born-again Christians. I hope that doesn't offend you. I think that's just part of the reality. In a heavily Catholic area like Miami, we often kind of throw around casual phrases. Miami is the least church. No, Miami's not the least church. It's evangelicalism that's less in Miami. But the reality is most people in Miami would say that they're Christians. It's a difficult field. It's a hard place to plant churches and to pastor, partly because so many people have a Christian veneer and don't ultimately know the gospel. Now, that is shrinking. Miami, as it increasingly, in South Florida, increasingly becomes secular, less nominally Catholic, more secular, as it becomes a global city, already is, but as it continues to grow as a global city, takes on in some places a more European feel and reflects the religious values that are there. Well, our success in most of our evangelism is reaching people who already think that they're Christians and sharing the gospel with them. We're finding the shrinking nominalism before us leads to a new reality that we're going to have to reach an increasingly secular world. And 2020 has accelerated that. Let me explain one reason why. I served as teaching pastor for about 6 years And you think in terms of, we have this balcony, and the balcony, and it might be the back rows for you, but the balcony and the back rows are where people who are kind of working their way into the church or working their way out of the church tend to go. There are certainly exceptions to that. Students can sit in a group in the balcony, whatever. In 2020, in most of our churches, the back rows or the balcony have gone. The nominally connected, the come every couple of months, the sort of I'm there, but I'm not always there people have disconnected largely from the life of church. And early on, everyone was so excited that they were getting all these views on Facebook, and then people kind of, threw a little cold water on, said that, views basically means, it was me, to be honest. I was watching all of your churches because I was fascinated to see what was going on. We were watching each other's churches. But what has happened is, best we can tell, that 20% of people in your church on a Sunday that were very nominally connected are now disconnected. This is one of the reasons why, for most of you, not for all of you, your giving has not collapsed. Now, in March and April, we were all concerned. Giving in most places experienced a sudden, sharp drop. But what's happened in most churches is that's plateaued at some level. Maybe it's stabilized at the way it was before. For most churches, it's actually at or better than 2019. Why? Because your committed Christians haven't left. But the people who are the nominally connected, those 20%, those back rows in that balcony, they're gone. And we have to re-engage them and ask the question, what does it look like as they were starting to maybe move towards that balcony would lead to the back row, that back row would lead to the middle rows, and how do we re-engage them? Those are missiological questions that we will have to address. Second is attitudes towards proselytizing. Now, one of the things we found is there's a growing sense, this has been around for a while, but I think what you're going to find is that the sense of sharing our faith is increasingly going to be seen as negative. Our culture is shifting, and 2020 gave that shift a additional boost. And I think we have to recognize that that is going to continue. The difficulty is going to continue there as well. Other issues that we have to address, and we'll have to walk through these kind of as we walk through. Go to the next one. I'll just kind of walk through as we go. Accelerating cultural shifts. And this affects those of us who are evangelicals who are on the wrong side of some cultural issues by the majority of people in culture and the views of these issues. We're finding, for example, the shift on sexuality has already been overwhelmingly made. The vast majority of Americans affirm same-sex marriage, but furthermore, the vast majority of Americans actually think it's a civil rights issue, and to them, it's like race. So as people who hold views that are outside of the mainstream of culture, for example, on same-sex marriage, I want you to know the world doesn't just see that as, it's fine, religious groups differ. They see that as akin to discriminating on the basis of immutable or unchangeable characteristics like race. And this creates some real challenges as we look to the future. Furthermore, the sexual identity and gender identity revolution, I mean, it took decades from Stonewall until Obergefell to see the shift on same-sex marriage. It took years to see the shift on, a handful of years, on gender identity. Now, largely affirmed that our sex at birth is not necessarily connected to our gender identification. And while we were dealing with the pandemic and while so many things were happening, many of us maybe have missed that actually the Supreme Court, in a major ruling that has significant impact on everything in the next 5 years, called Bostock, actually ruled that gender identity is to be protected in the same way that discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual identity is now in that same category. And with the incoming Biden administration committing to bringing the Equality Act, this is going to have a lot of ramifications for us. I'm not here to be the political person or the political expert, but I want you to not to miss that this has a lot of ramifications. Also coming out of the last 4 years, let's go on to next, is let's talk some about the image of evangelicals. And yeah, I've already mentioned President Trump's name. So regardless of where you are politically, let's talk about statistics. I'm going to talk some math here. You can be mad at me, you can send letters, you can Jesse Carbo at idon'tcare.com. But statistically, we know, this is just math, and math doesn't care about your feelings, is that the evangelical reputation has been impacted in a way that has made it challenging for many of us in multicultural churches and multicultural settings, right? But as I'm pastoring this Calvary Baptist Church in New York City, I will tell you the conversations that we have to do with some of the bridges that have been burned in the last 4 years as evangelicals have, white evangelicals have aggressively embraced President Trump. And so part of that's a headwinds that we're still going to be facing as we deal with kind of the next steps of what this ultimately will take. And so in the midst of all this, we kind of find that there is a shift in culture. And one of the final shifts I want to talk about is the shift from a jump-started shift from come and see to go and share. Now, I want to say this to you that for 30 years, there have been people like me and others who've been writing books and doing angsty podcasts and, articles about how the church needs to leave the building and all that sort of stuff. And then in about 2 weeks, everybody left the building everywhere. Actually, even when the churches were shut down, about only 6% of churches continue to meet, which I always thought was fascinating, that 6% of churches, when they kind of shut down everything, continued to meet. But now about 65% of churches are back meeting in some fashion. I mentioned Calvary Chapel, Fort Lauderdale on this weekend, and they were every other row, following, everyone wearing a mask, following those guidelines. And it's different in different places. I will tell you, having been in Florida for the last 2 weeks and staying a couple more, you guys are taking the pandemic very differently in Florida than we are in Illinois. So it's kind of interesting to see how people respond. In Illinois, they pretty much shut everything down, and that's why I'm here. So anyway, and I'm one of those people are like, well, don't come from Illinois with coronavirus. I'm all good. I was tested before I came. And then Jesse's like, hey, let's hang out. I'm like, no, we're not ever hanging out with Jesse again. But here's the thing. Again, much of our evangelism and mission strategy was built on bringing people to church, maybe Christmas or Easter. I can assure you, your Christmas Eve service is not going to be packed filled with people who don't know the Lord like it might normally be. And probably your Easter service is not going to be as well. I don't really remember. Are we like public with this afterwards, or can I give some non-public examples? Do you know? No, okay, I don't know either. I can use non-public examples. Okay, so a couple weeks ago, had a meeting with Dr. Francis Collins and Dr. Deborah Burke. Some of you remember Dr. Burke. And Dr. Francis Collins is actually Dr. Fauci's boss. Met with about 15 evangelical leaders, I guess, talking about how do we walk through this next phase when conspiracies are just gone rampant. People, the vaccine is going to be the mark of the beast and all this kind of stuff. And so both Dr. Burks, who's a graduate of Houghton College and is an evangelical Christian, and Dr. Collins goes to McLean Presbyterian Church. He's a PCA in a PCA church. They're committed Christians, and yet, this space. So we asked them some questions. So when do we think that, we're going to be reaching people for Christ by inviting them to church again? I didn't ask it exactly that way, but some variant of that. And they said not Christmas and not Easter. So you just got to know that season. Now, here's the question. Will that come by next Christmas? Well, the answer is probably yes, because the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And every time there's been a pandemic, Christians return to norm and form within, say, 6 months to a year. So, and sometimes they didn't even stop. I mean, during the Black Death, Christians met in cathedrals before the Black Death, during the Black Death, and after the Black Death. And it wasn't that they were unaware that proximity spread disease. They knew that. They didn't know what a virus was then, but they knew near people, get sick, away from people, don't get sick. And so I was kind of sobered by that. In Easter of this year, I was preaching at Moody Church. I think by then, the new pastor, Philip Miller, had been called. I had about 2 months left in my service there. And I looked out in this empty room, in downtown Chicago, the heart of the city, a very secular city, very challenging. And in an empty room that by law, the mayor of Chicago is not letting groups more than 50 meet. But by law, and I can tell you, having 50 people in a sanctuary that is, a cathedral-sized sanctuary. But I was also humbled by the fact that Paul Rader was speaking to the same church 100 years earlier during the Spanish flu. And they pressed through, they lived on the mission, they focused on Jesus, and the end result was They return in some ways to form, which I don't think is all good. We'll talk about that. But, just to, again, remind ourselves, Chuck Van Engen puts it this way: the evangelization of North America is not optional. It's the reason we exist. It's commanded by a Lord. What a wonderful gift from God. Our participation in God's mission makes us instruments through whom the nations of the earth may be blessed. So when we think missiologically, the question is how has our cultural context changed? I think that's the next slide, is the Van Engen quote. How has our cultural context changed in such a way that we're going to be engaging in some real different cultural milieus? Now, we actually did a survey a few years ago. We surveyed unchurched people who haven't been at church, synagogue, or a mosque for anything other than a wedding, holiday, or funeral for 3 years. And we asked them which, if any, this is a survey of 2,000 unchurched Americans. This is the unchurched report. Let's take a look at the data. Which, if any, of the following life experiences would make you open to consider turning to the church for help? Again, the language, we would say the language differently. We're talking to unchurched people. So turning to the church, we couldn't ask them what would cause you to repent of your sin, be born again by grace and through faith, right? So that's not how they think. But turning to the church to help. All of you taking pictures. Did I give you permission to take pictures of my slides? Would you like the slide presentation anyway? How about I just give you the slide presentation? Jesse will email you this slide presentation. At Wheaton College, we share because we care. So I'll give you this presentation. You can have all these things as well. So go through Jesse and he'll get it out to you. But which of the following, and notice, facing death, losing someone I love, facing a health crisis, recognizing an addiction, drugs and alcohol, moving to a new area, whatever else it may be. I will tell you that I believe that particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, I think the most open people probably were in the totality of our lifetime was during Easter week of 2020. I believe there never will be a time that was as open as Easter week of 2020. We saw people come to faith in Christ. I saw my family, who are not church, they're not believers, they all watched the Easter service, as an online service that we did at Moody Church. And I will tell you that people I have been sharing the gospel with, so many responded. Well, during the times when the pandemic gets difficult, and that was sort of early on, we didn't know all of what that meant, et cetera, et cetera. Man, I didn't throw thermoses around during your talk. It's all good, man. Good to see you. Good to see you. And wonderful talk too, by the way. But here's the thing. Right at that time, we didn't know all that was going to happen. Matter of fact, President Trump would later say, he first shut down the country for 2 weeks and then for a month. And he said, if we don't, then 2 million people could die. And people heard that number and they were taking very seriously. And then Easter came. Well, I will tell you that as we enter into this surge, which Dr. Fauci said yesterday, could be a surge on top of a surge, that you're going to find an openness at Christmas time, but not an openness to gather. So what will you do? How will you engage missiologically in this time? Well, one of the things that we're doing at Calvary is we're actually going to do Facebook Lives. We're asking everybody, I'm actually going to be there. Our next service, we met November 1, December 20th, end of January, end of February, because that's the best we can do under the laws that we have in New York City right now with the space that we have. And so we're going to ask everybody in the church on Sunday after church to do a Facebook Live, their own Facebook Live. You can do that. There's a little button, and you can just talk there and give your testimony. You can say, hey, and you can tag people and invite them to hear that. And so we have to think different. Our strategy and structure, not our mission, vision, values, but our strategy and structure change because our ability to engage people has changed. But I still think that the opportunities before us remain. Now, mind you, we got to be careful because the pandemic's not a good thing. It's a horrible thing. It's the greatest global crisis of our lifetime, not necessarily for you individually, but for us together. So for us, we can seize the moment to show and share the love of Jesus. Here's another question we asked. Which, if any, of the following, remember, we're kind of asking in ways that unchurched people would respond, which, if any of the following, would make you more interested in listening to what Christians had to say? Okay, listening to what Christians had to say. Well, here's one. I saw them treat others better because of the faith. I saw them caring for people's needs because of their faith. I saw them happier because of their faith. I saw them stand against injustice because of their faith. I saw them use their faith to solve problems in the community. I don't know about you, but that's a description of church action in 2020 from a survey we took in 2016. So these things, which is why I joined with many other Christian faith leaders in Chicago and joined in the Faith Leaders March and after George Floyd's killing. It's why we needed to listen to and say, what's going on? Why is there this perception in our African-American community that their lives may not matter? Because now here's the reality. What we found is it's actually people of faith, particularly white evangelicals, who have pushed back on that narrative. But the reality is for us to see brokenness and injustice and not address it means that we're not engaged in the mission that Jesus has sent us on. Now, at the same time, we ask these questions because we had a simple question, is what's going to cause you to listen so we can share the gospel with you? Right at the beginning of the pandemic, I wrote an article for USA Today, which could be in a sense called Missiology for the pandemic. And by the time, in March, it was kind of unique and new to quote and talk about plagues throughout history. Everyone's done that now. If you haven't mentioned that in your church yet as an illustration, it's time to do that. You got to mention how Christians have served in the midst of difficult times. But I quoted Eusebius, the church historian, and Eusebius wrote about the 4th century Christians, and he said, I'm going to quote, because this is what I wrote in USA Today, shared the gospel, and I love doing that in secular publications. But I wrote what Eusebius said is that after the pandemic, that the Christians, quote, deeds were on everyone's lips, and they glorified the God of the Christians. The deeds of the Christians were on everyone's lips. They glorified the God of the Christians. I think ultimately that's what this survey is telling us. And I think that's what's happened. Now, not every church has stepped up, stepped out, stood in the gap, but many have. And in some ways, it undermines the narrative of the headwinds that are before us. The headwinds that are before us have to do with the perception of Christians. The loving actions of Christians have to do with undermining the perceptions, the false perceptions, the defeater beliefs that people have about Christians. Now, when we talk about missiology is a multifaceted field, and here we find ourselves in a complex time. You know, this is not the most divided time that we've ever been as a nation, for sure, that we had this thing called a civil war. But for some of us, it's the most divided time in our lifetime. It's the most divided time I can remember in mine. But some of you may remember or have read in history books about 1968. Because 1968 was perhaps more divided than we are right now. 1968, the Vietnam War protests were filling the streets. At the same time, the civil rights protesters were speaking up for injustice and more. In my town, my city of Chicago, I live in the Chicagoland area, there were riots, but the commission that studied the riots called it a police riot during the Democratic National Convention. And then there were riots in response to assassinations. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated April 4th, 1968, and Bobby Kennedy assassinated that same year. What you may not remember, too, is that that was the time of a great global pandemic. It was called the Hong Kong flu, and it was interesting. People responded differently, and they still had Woodstock, for example, which I can assure you spread a lot of disease of different kinds. But all this took place, and the world was remarkably divided. Probably the greatest difference would be that the economy was booming at that time, whereas ours has been struggling. And yet, from that, I want you to miss this, right? 1968, people were wondering if we were about to enter a civil war. People were talking about law and order. We need law and order in the streets. There was an election, and remarkably divided time. And in the midst of that, the Holy Spirit was at work. We're actually doing a research project, the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, in partnership with the Center for the Work and Study of the Holy Spirit today at Bully University. And we're doing it on the 40th anniversary of the Jesus People movement. And depending on when you count the beginning of that, excuse me, the 50th anniversary of the Jesus People movement, we had a big conference planned in October a few months ago. But the idea of getting those Jesus People movement are all in their 70s now. The idea of getting a bunch of 7-year-olds together in the midst of a pandemic didn't resonate well. You're ready to go, Gene. Gene's like, he's raising his hand, I'll go. But it didn't resonate well with a lot of people, so we postponed it a year. But you know, what began to happen in 1968 began to fully flourish by the time we got to 1970. But the most divided time in maybe the 1900s we saw God working. And a guy named Chuck Smith, he was a Foursquare pastor, went to Life Pacific Bible College, and was kind of moving away from the Foursquare and starting their own movement. And someone brought home a guy named Lonnie Frisbee, who was this hippie. And soon this movement, Donald Miller, the scholar Donald Miller, not the cool guy who writes Blue Like Jazz, but the scholar Donald Miller, University of Los Angeles, UCLA, he wrote a book called Reinventing American Protestantism. I don't want you to miss this, because in 1968 began the movement that would later birth Calvary Chapel and the Vineyard and the Hope Chapel movement, and that would literally reinvent American Protestantism. So is God up to something in 2020? I think he is. I don't know what it's going to be fully yet. I don't think you know. I don't think I know. But I think right now we have to think differently. And my ecclesiological presupposition is, with a missiological focus, is this: we need a temporarily deficient ecclesiology in the emergency for the sake of the mission. So let me explain. I think ultimately, as most of you are in church planting or church planting connection, and many of you have, as church planners, you don't think a lot about ecclesiology. That's things that theologians do, but all of a sudden you have to. What is this thing that we have, and does it require gathering to exist? The assumption always was yes. The assumption was, for most of us, that online church was an entryway. It was a portal to engage people in what would be a real in-person church. And we talk about things like Christology, who is Jesus, missiology, and ecclesiology. And here we have to ask about the pandemic and our church plants. A few years ago, I wrote, well, more than a decade ago, I wrote about this in a little graphic that I created. Some of you have heard that missiology, Christology should lead to our missiology, should lead to our ecclesiology. And of course, you'll recognize immediately that Alan Hirsch and Mike Frost talked about that in their book, The Shape of Things to Come. And I differed with them, and we're actually friends, and they differ in the way they articulate it now too. But here we're having to ask ecclesiological questions with a missiological frame that we didn't have to ask before. And right now, if your Christology leads to your missiology, leads to your ecclesiology, the missiology of the pandemic would basically say, do anything to reach people. And what I want to say to you is this, and I hope you'll receive this in a nice way. In the 80s, Christian leaders said, do anything to reach people, and the seeker movement was born, and God used it in a lot of wonderful and powerful ways. Yet for most of us, there are things that we look at the seeker movement and say, that had some unintended side effects. Let's not do that again. And then we saw the emerging church movement, and some of that became very impactful in reaching different kinds of people. Yet we would look back on it, emerging church movement one Thursday in 2010, everyone just said, nah, let's not do that anymore. And it just sort of went away. But we would look back and say, man, a lot of people were reached, but there are a lot of things that were there that we needed to think about that later we had to undo. Just as in the seeker movement, there were things that had to be undone. In the emerging church movement, things had to be undone. And what I want to say to you is, if we casually rush into, let's do whatever it takes to reach people, we'll kind of repeat the errors that some of us are old enough to remember in our own lifetime that we rushed into and had to undo some of the errors. Could we instead think now, Christologically, who is Jesus? What has he sent us to do? Missiologically, what forms and strategies should we use to most effectively expand the kingdom we're sent? Ecclesiology, what expression of a New Testament church would be most appropriate in this context? And don't do things now that you have to undo later, but communicate now. It's a temporarily deficient ecclesiology in the emergency for the sake of the mission. Now, I want to explain this just briefly, and then I think my time is about up. I want to explain this just briefly, and I've got lots more in the PowerPoint that that would have been so good, but not for you. If you wouldn't mind, just go to the very last slide. Make sure you click through all of them so they feel a sense of envy and loss as you click through it slowly. And that would have been so good, but not for you. So last slide. So some principles, much more to take and say and do on this subject. This might be a strange time, but I want to encourage you to consider elevating your ecclesiology. In fact, let me quote a Beth Moore tweet. Right, a Beth Moore tweet. Beth, we're super excited. Beth's actually teaching a class with us at Wheaton this summer, so we're excited. She's going to be teaching the Bible. We'll be co-teaching, of course, and we love Beth. But she tweeted something last Easter that I think was really good, and she said, "Next year in church." Now, I might have said in, because I don't think church is a where, but a who and a when. And so, but the reality is I really want to encourage you to teach people that what you're doing right now is out of the norm, and you intend to, when you can, bring people together, because that's part of what a church is. One of the things I'm saying when I talk at churches, I just yesterday at Calvary Chapel, I said, I recognize that 30% are in church and 70% are still watching online, but no one gets left behind. Right? We recognize that people are responding differently. People have different situations. Someone's got a kid at home struggling with leukemia. Someone's got asthma. Their situation is different. Nobody gets left behind. But we have to say to them, this is a temporarily deficient situation. We're still on mission. It's in the emergency for the sake of the mission. Emphasize the emergency. We're going to do some things. Don't over clever this moment. Don't like, well, we're all online now, so we're going to blaze a whole new path for how we do baptisms online. I would say it's okay to wait and say, right now we're having to do this in different ways. Maybe we're waiting till later, next year. Maybe we'll do this when, maybe a year's too long, but maybe we'll do this in ways. Because here's the thing, I want you to be on display, all of your pastors and church leaders, to be on display before your people, the angst that something is missing. Because if you don't, they're going to get used to it. And the end result is they're not going to re-engage in the true embodied life of church. Engage the mission. One of my greatest concerns is that 2 years from now, we'll just be back to the way we were. Our churches are engaged in mission in a higher and fresh way. Let's not lose that now. Let's talk about this. This is the way it's supposed to be all the time. The church is not the building. The church is not a where, it's a who, and we're on mission together. We have elevated and empowered leaders to a different level to engage in different ways. Let's not lose that. And I would still encourage you toward the right ordering of church, to say, in the midst of the emergency, for the sake of the mission, we're going to do some things, but we're missing something. And next year or next month, or at our church in New York City, we're just gathering once a month, and literally only a fraction of the church is coming or can come. But nobody gets left behind, because we're going somewhere together. Ephesians 3:10 says God has chosen the church to make known his manifold wisdom in the world. And at this moment, God's not asking us to throw out a definition of what the church is. He's asking us, he's leading us. I believe he's prompting us to be faithful, to show and share the love of Jesus, to think missiologically about our ecclesiology, to think biblically about it as well. So the end result is, when we come to the other side of this pandemic, people will have seen the deeds of Christians and glorify the God of the Christians. And Christians will have seen the value of community that in some ways was taken away from them, and they engage in embodied community at an even higher level. Thanks for the opportunity to share with you. As again, I'll have this PowerPoint out. If you have questions about our that's an MA, that's a master's degree, an MA program. If you have questions about our MA, you can see me at the lunch break, and happy to engage with you on that as well. And we'll be in touch again by email through Jesse. And Jesse, get well and rest. Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to share.